Namaskar and welcome to the Garuda Talks episode today. And today we are talking with author Aarnab Mitra. And the book I have in my hand is called The Wasted Decades. The Wasted Decades, 1947 to 1991. How poor leadership, lack of vision, flawed ideology, crony capitalism, rampant corruption, and dynastic succession kept India backward and poor. And the author with me is Sri Aarnab Mitra. Welcome to the show, Arnabji.
Thank you.
So I was looking through the book, and it's a book that a lot of times you wish somebody wrote this book. So I'm glad you actually wrote it, because we have this impression in our mind of so much time and so much post-independence energy being lost. But why do you call it the wasted decades?
Well, you see, I'm coming from a position not of ideology or hatred. I'm coming from a position of betrayal and a deep sense of being let down by someone I used to admire very much. You see, I come from a staunchly Congress family, and I grew up admiring the Nehru Gandhis. I believed in the spiel that they were the makers of modern India, that Nehru's temples of democracy, temples of modern India really helped industrialize India, that Indira Gandhi was like Ma Durga. And I had no idea how far behind India had fallen behind not only the European and American countries, but even the peers in Southeast Asia. The scales began to drop when I first went abroad post the liberalization process. And there I saw it with my own eyes how far we had fallen. And that's when I began to research on it. But those days, we didn't have the internet, so we couldn't possibly access all the material that we have in our hands today. People told me that I was wrong. No, Nehru was indeed the builder of India. Indira Gandhi was his able successor, and Rajiv Gandhi carried on that legacy. As I had the privilege of traveling abroad more often, every time I visited, my belief was further ingrained in me. Thereafter, in the post internet era, I got access to material that showed me that I was right. Those were the decades that our peers in Southeast Asia went ahead of us. Those were the decades during which Europe and Japan rebuilt from the rubble of the Second World War and went on to become economic powerhouses that they had been before. India missed the bus completely. And those were the days that India could have caught up with the world, because there were several low-hanging fruit economically. That is why I call it the wasted decades.
So what do you think, what was the biggest reason for this? I remember seeing a chart, in fact, where China at the time of independence of India, so in 1947, 1950, has a lower GDP per capita than India. And so we see the Chinese graph climbing fairly steeply, where the Indian graph is much less, and so it intersects pretty quickly. And then China, especially after the reforms later on in the 80s, it really starts to go forward much faster. So what do you think is the single biggest blunder that happened from Indian leadership that caused us to have these missteps?
It was a perfect storm. Several missteps followed one another, but I think the biggest mistake was to abjure exports. Jawaharlal Nehru is on record as having said that exports were a way of exploiting countries and the first step towards becoming a colonial power, or something to that effect. So his policies specifically avoided the export component that took our neighbors and our peers up the value chain. You see, 1950 to 1970 was known as the golden age of capitalism. That was when world trade boomed more than 300%. And there was a huge tolerance all across the world for for poor standards, for substandard goods. India could have used its cheap labor to start exporting little things like toys, bicycles, sewing machines, pots and pans. That's what Japan did and moved up the value chain slowly. When Japan vacated the lower end of the market, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, Singapore, and Hong Kong, they filled up the lower end. We missed the bus completely. And that, I think, was the single biggest blunder that India made.
But why did we miss the bus? I mean, obviously, the lower you're saying we didn't rise up the manufacturing ladder, but from a policy standpoint, I mean, what is it that they could have done differently?
A, they could have had an export orientation in the economic policy. B, the second 5-year plan, which focused on heavy industries, was a huge mistake. You see, India was a labor surplus, capital starved country. Yet the Mahalanobis plan focused on a capital intensive, labor scarce policy to industrialize India. Very soon, we fell short of capital. Inflation rose. We needed to borrow more from abroad. Then there wasn't, because the plan had underestimated expenses and because of rising inflation, it there was a huge overrun in costs, as a result of which there wasn't enough money for other industries, the consumer industries, and this led to a perfect storm. Year after year, we fell short of the employment target because, at best, the Mahalanobis plan could have led to employment 25 years thereafter. But unfortunately, the plan failed, and so did our employment generation. And that, had we gone in for, say, something like the wage goods model, which is making items of daily use, we could have used unskilled farm labor and transferred them to industry, which is what every other country in the world did. This would have sorted out both the unemployment and the disguised unemployment in the rural sector, as well as created the basic foundation for an industrialized nation. Unfortunately, we missed the bus there as well. Thereafter,
Definitely.
there was also a failure on education. Primary education, especially education of women, played a huge role in the development of Japan and then the rest of East and Southeast Asia. Most women didn't study beyond the sixth standard, but that was enough to instill in them a sense of decorum, a sense of discipline, and the ability to absorb technologies. That didn't happen in India. That was another huge failure.
Absolutely. And in reading through your book, I saw, you have this also figure also that that Korea's per capita income was 40%
Yes,
below India.
that's right.
And it's stunning that we actually we have a lot of blame that we lay on colonialism and British colonialism and all of that. But despite all of those problems, India was still ahead at independence, and
Of course,
we actually went
we had,
much further behind in this wasted decade. Decades.
and yes, of course, and we had Asia's only functioning steel plants because Japan had been bombed to rubble. We had Asia's only functioning aircraft factory, HAL, and we had Asia's only standing industrial base because the Southeast Asian countries were mainly commodity producers. So were we, but we also had an industrial base, a fledgling base, but at least one that could have been built on had the leadership then shown vision, ambition, and courage.
I definitely see that the wasted decades. There was a lot of policy missteps. You talk about the license Raj, and as somebody who spent a lot
Yes.
of time in the US and started companies there and then started to do business here, I feel even now we really aren't completely free from this over regulating bureaucratic mindset, and that's certainly the foundation of all of that was laid in what you call the wasted decades. So speak about this kind of
Yes, of course.
policy paralysis, and not only policy paralysis but the kind of paralysis it caused on industry in the way the policies were made.
You know, when a few years before his demise, Nehru was asked to pinpoint his greatest failure, and he said, I have failed to reform the bureaucracy. It is still a colonial bureaucracy. Now, the colonial bureaucracy was not trained to serve the needs of modern industry. Their main job was revenue collection, law and order, and some social services. They were not trained to run or monitor industries. But because Nehru wanted to keep the public sector at the commanding heights of the economy, he handed over the management of the economy to bureaucrats who were completely untrained for the job. So they did what they knew best, which is, put up barriers to all kinds of economic freedom. If you go back in history, you'll see that during the Second World War, many countries had put in place regulations and licenses for their industries. But once the war was over, they began deregulating. India, on the other hand, went the other way. We began to overregulate, and soon this became a rent-seeking avenue. So every politician worth his salt added new regulations, added new barriers, and used it as a rent-seeking mechanism. This also led to the spread of corruption and crony capitalism. So all these came together in a perfect storm and stymied India's economic growth.
Absolutely. And the way I see it is that the remnants of that policy of bureaucratic overreach, I mean, what do we really think we made some changes after 1991, but did we make sufficient changes, or are we still grappling with the problems of the bureaucracy
No,
even today?
no. You see, even today, the bureaucracy is untrained to regulate industries because a bureaucrat's first instinct is to stop something and then take a look. Then there's also this thing through proper channel. That I think adds to the bureaucracy. And although we don't have the license Raj anymore, we still have the inspector Raj, and that is also a huge roadblock to fast growth. We are still one of the most overregulated economies in the world.
Absolutely. And coming back to the Nehruvian era, and you talk about this whole dynastic succession and the way there was this stranglehold. What do you think was the part played by sort of fashion of Fabian socialism, or they're just like having this out of touch, fashionable ideas with no experience in either economic matters or really understanding of even the Indian cultural milieu, to see how you let loose people in terms of inspiring them to create and progress. So it feels like there was this kind of uh, ivory tower ideas, that were carried on, especially in this whole socialist era, and that was coming from a fashion of Europe, literally.
Um, it came with Nehru's vision of Fabian socialism. In fact, I was shocked to read a speech of his. This was in 1936 when he was the Congress president. He said, I see no possibility of growth without socialism, and that will mean the end of private property, except in a very, just a moment, except in a, I'll just quote, I see no way of ending the poverty, the vast unemployment, the degradation, and the subjection of the Indian people except through socialism. That means the ending of private property except in a restricted sense, and the replacement of the present profit system by a higher ideal of cooperative service. It means a new civilization radically different from the present capitalist order. This was part of Nehru's presidential address to the Congress in 1936.
Wow. And this is in your book?
This is my book.
Yes. The book we are discussing is The Wasted Decades, 1947 to 1991, by Aarnab Mitra, who is with me today. And so I'd love to actually see what page is this on, Arnabji?
It'll be in chapter 1.
Okay.
It'll be in chapter. It'll be in no. It'll be in chapter 1, where I quote him. You find
Yes,
it
yes,
within the
yes.
first few pages.
Yes, yes, I see that. A costly mistake.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I think this is really the as I said, I think it, but partly this was a fashionable idea, right? I mean, Nehru is, I don't see him as particularly intelligent or somebody who's really coming up with anything. It's he's simply copying fashionable theories from the Oxford Circle in England or what have you, without really going to the bottom of it.
That's right. Which is why I say that's not the sign of a visionary. A visionary
Hmm.
charts, blazes new trails where no one has set foot before. So Nehru, the visionary, is a post facto creation of very, very, very amenable historians.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, because I don't see any vision except copying things that he had heard from somewhere. And
And not
what
only
is
and not only that, that thereafter it became like a rent-seeking mechanism because politicians, one after the other, started putting in regulations from which they could milk their own revenues and feather their own nests. In fact, I've quoted from the K. Santanam Committee report. This, because of rampant corruption by 1962, there was widespread discontent in society, and the few remaining Gandhians who excoriated Nehru for rising corruption in his administration. So the Nehru government set up a parliamentary panel headed by a Congress member called K. Santanam. His report came out in 1964. It was a parliamentary report where he said it has become the practice for higher authorities, ministers as well as bureaucrats and the lower bureaucracy, to charge between 7 and 11% of every contract that they handed out. This paved the way for crony capitalism.
and the
In fact, if
you know
you
this
read reports from that era, you'll see that every large business house, every large and medium business house had a battalion of so called liaison officers posted in Delhi. Their only job was to track the movement of license applications, their own as well as their rivals. So the idea was to expedite the licenses for their own employers and block the licenses of their rivals. So what happened was maybe 5 licenses were being given out. The same group managed maybe 3 licenses under different names and then used one to manufacture, to begin manufacturing, and they would sit on 2 others. So there would be a ready-made shortage in the market. This would lead to black marketing, bribes, and corruption.
absolutely, and it's such a contrast. You also mentioned this with Lee Kuan in Singapore,
Yes,
who was actually a visionary. He was a visionary because he was willing to question ideological straitjackets in how one
that's
is
right.
supposed to do things and forge a new path.
And he was also a socialist to start with. He began his life as a socialist.
Hmm.
And it was only by trial and error that he became a free market maven.
Absolutely. And then how do you see the successors of Nehru, especially the Nehru Gandhi clan, in terms of whether they changed anything or made things worse? How do the wasted decades play out after Nehru?
You see, this is where dynastic succession comes into play. Because Nehru was the patriarch of the family, to accept that he had been wrong would lead to tarnishing of the family legacy. So no one could dare question the Nehruvian policy and the Nehruvian legacy. And if you see what happened after the Mahalanobis plan, the entire heavy industries paradigm and the public sector paradigm got hardwired into the Indian bureaucratic system. So much so that even today, people question the free market, and somehow many people seem to think that the Nehruvian era was some kind of an idyll, some kind of a Camelot, some kind of a golden age for post-independence India.
Well, this is a golden
Whereas
age for a
it's a
small section of elite who got
very, very,
the secured position and for Lutyens Delhi to strut about,
yes. And frankly, if you ask me, I think it was a very dreary and desolate place to live in. The Nehruvian and the post-Nehruvian era. I remember even when I was growing up in Calcutta. I mean, we were fortunate to have cooking gas in our house, but I would read in the papers that there was a regular shortage of coal and kerosene, which were the two main fuel for most middle class homes, and they had to be bought in the black market. There was a shortage
Absolutely.
of everything from rice, wheat, coal, kerosene, even scooters and cars. Can you beat it? Scooters and
Yes.
cars. I mean,
I remember there used to be bookings for 2 years to get a
that's
scooter and to get a car, and there was for a telephone it took years and years. I mean, to get
yes,
a telephone line in your home was an impossibility.
yes. You needed to know an MLA and a recommendation from an MLA, and then phones would stop working for months on end, and all complaints would result in only one answer: cable fault.
Yes. So
In
it's
fact,
it's
remember, in fact, if you remember CM Stephen, the Congress leader who was telecom minister in Indira Gandhi's government, said, "Don't complain about non-working telephones. Give them to me." He actually had the
absolutely.
temerity to tell Parliament that telephones were a luxury item, so people shouldn't complain about non-working telephones.
Yes, everything was made a luxury. Living was made a luxury, and certainly
Exactly.
free speech was made a luxury. I know you have a section on this as well, and I have been very perturbed. In fact, the legacy of the Congress has continued, where recently they had some bill come up in Karnataka, which is curbing free speech, and you were actually in the middle of all this because you have been a senior journalist and been with major media houses. So
That's right.
what is tell me some story and what was going on with respect to free speech, because today the narrative is made that we are facing fascism and Nehru's era was this great glorious period of freedom and liberalism and free speech.
Okay. What were the means of disseminating information in the Nehruvian era? You had newspapers, you had All India Radio, and I think television came after his passing. So you had newspapers. 80% of the country was illiterate. So newspapers were beyond them. Of the remaining 20%, maybe a tenth, which is about 2% of the population, read newspapers. So the only means of disseminating information was through All India Radio, which was a government monopoly. Very, very few people could travel abroad to see what was really happening from the outside looking inside. So there was effective censorship. The government could send whatever message they wanted to the people, and there was no way for anyone else to counter it. The few newspapers that existed then ran mainly on government advertisements, and most of them, the owners anyway, were mostly affiliated to the establishment. So there was very little dissemination of non-adulatory news to the public at large. That to me was also a form of censorship.
Absolutely, but at the same time, there was a very direct assault as well. I mean, the First Amendment itself in the
Yes,
Indian Constitution is curbing free speech compared to the First Amendment in the US, which is for protecting free speech.
that's right. The First Amendment, and mind you, the First Amendment was passed by an unelected government because
And it, and it was still
more than 25% of parliament was nominated,
hmm,
princely states and other special interests.
right.
And Nehru was an unelected prime minister. It was Sardar Patel who was elected to become the prime minister, but the election was overruled by Gandhi, who selected Nehru. So, A, the parliament didn't have the moral right to amend the constitution, and B, Nehru didn't have the moral authority to lead the government. So, how do
which
you
is
say
which is
that?
also concerning, because if that provision was had wide support, then it should have been debated in the Constituent Assembly itself. rather than right afterwards.
That's right. And mind you, the First Amendment has another very deleterious clause, which is the ninth schedule of the Constitution. The ninth schedule is a kind of a locker where Parliament can place a law, effectively putting it beyond judicial review. So Nehru also did that.
Yes,
He
yes.
curbed the power of the judiciary by creating this ninth schedule of the Constitution, where the government of the day can place the law in that safe. It's like a safe keeping locker, and no individual can challenge it in a court of law. I don't think that's a very democratic. It doesn't speak well of Nehru's democratic credentials.
Absolutely. And the other area that you put out in your book, again, the book we are talking about is called The Wasted Decades by Sri Aarnab Mitra, is also the area of education, something which has been very close to my heart as well, in terms of how far we fell behind in education, and we are still really not at par with countries like China or any of these countries which have made a significant investment in education.
You see, true, because this again, we go back to the temples of modern India strategy, because the government grossly underestimated the expenditure on industry. It had to divert funds from other departments and other important programs. The one to suffer most was education. Every time the government fell short of funds, it would cut the allocation for industry and divert it, cut the allocation for education and divert the funds. So, basic education, primary education suffered. Strangely, the government did not flinch from spending crores of rupees on higher education institutes. Yes, IITs, IIMs, these were definitely visionary steps for a poor country, and Nehru deserves credit for actually going ahead with it. But effectively, they've created the Nehruvian education policy has created three classes of Indians. One is the English educated, highly qualified IIT and foreign returned graduates. Then we come to a vernacular educated middle layer. And then we have the vast masses of uneducated Indians. So effectively, we had a very thin sliver of highly educated Indians, which we still do. There's a slightly broader layer of vernacular educated Indians who make up the lower bureaucracy and the lower echelons of corporate India and a part of trade and industry. Below it, there's a vast mass of people who are not educated at all, who can barely sign their names. So effectively, the Nehruvian education policy has created a plutocracy, in my opinion. And if you look at Macaulay's Minutes of Education, he said, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect." If you really go deep into it and look at it, this Macaulayan vision found its full expression in Nehru's India and his education policy. In fact, if Nehru's education policy was one of hits and misses, Indira Gandhi was very cynical. She actually said, and I quote, that what has education done for the West? If anything, it has made them more shallow, or something to that effect. And if you go by investment, experts globally say that investment in education should be 4 to 6% of GDP. In India, it never crossed 2%. This was done during the Nehruvian era by Nehru and his daughter. So obviously, I mean, I would be a little cautious about saying this about Nehru, but about Indira Gandhi, I have no hesitation in saying that she perhaps wanted an uneducated and docile population rather than an educated one that could question her on the state of the nation.
You also mentioned their undermining of democracy. You have a whole chapter on this. So, coming
That's right.
from policy and education and economics to democracy itself, because we hear a lot of slogans of democracy in danger, but you recounted, and I certainly lived through the time of the emergency and even before and after that, where you know the whole legacy of the Congress has been so many book bans and subtle banning and deplatforming of artists and views and journalists, media. So, how do you score them in terms of democracy?
Well, you see, the original sin was Nehru's accession to the prime ministership. It was a very, very undemocratic act. It was a unilateral act of selection by Gandhi by overruling a democratic election. Tell me something. If Nehru had indeed been the exemplar of democratic rectitude, shouldn't he have politely declined Gandhi's offer and said, no, Patel has won it fair and square. He should be the prime minister? That was the original sin, an undemocratic act. Then in 1950, after Patel's death, Nehru was finding it difficult to pull along with Purushottam Das Tandon, the then Congress president. Finally, Tandon resigned, and Nehru kept the Congress presidency for himself for the next 2 terms. Effectively, the two major offices in India, the Prime Minister and the Congress President, resided in the body of one person, Nehru. Was that a very democratic act? Then, in 1957, he acquiesced to Indira Gandhi, his daughter, becoming the Congress President, effectively monopolizing power in one family under one roof. Was that very democratic? He acquiesced to Indira Gandhi and syndicate of Congress leaders, overthrowing the elected government of EMS Namboodiripad in Kerala. Was that democratic? And can you imagine, he actually jailed Majroor Sultanpuri, the noted lyricist, for calling him Hitler ki chela. Can you imagine what might happen in today's day and age if leaders and activists were to be arrested for similar slurs against the Prime Minister?
Absolutely, and as I mentioned, I don't think that has stopped. I was just recently reviewing this new bill that Karnataka is passing in the name of hate speech, which basically criminalizes disparaging remarks. Now, if you're going to criminalize disparaging remarks in a democracy, how can you even run a democracy?
I fear for myself. Once this book reaches Karnataka, they might issue an arrest warrant against me.
Yes, this is the way that they have been going about it. So it's a very dangerous situation, and the irony is that the Congress has put this propaganda forth, saying that it's the liberal alternative and it's the free speech alternative, and the other side is the one that is curbing speech, and so on and so forth.
Nonsense. It was called the Congress that got an article that got in Section 66A of the IT Act. You remember? And
no, explain what was this about?
There was this. It was basically a means of articles. Section 66A was inserted into the IT Act to curb what they considered disparaging speech in the digital world. In effect, it was to curb anti-Congress propaganda. The Supreme Court struck it down. The Supreme Court struck it down as ultra-vires of the Constitution.
Absolutely, and the Congress, the Constitution certainly does not define hate speech, and there is also no provision. One of the provisions in this free speech thing, which they inserted through this First Amendment, was anything which can cause, social unrest, which means you basically, or disharmony. Karnataka bill even goes further, disharmony. Well, many speeches can cause disharmony, and you're also handing veto power to anybody who will create disharmony because they don't like a particular speech. So essentially,
exactly.
It basically curbs it completely.
And it's very, very loosely worded, so it depends on the person interpreting the law. I mean, what is fair criticism to me could be disparaging to you.
Absolutely.
And if you really look at the last few years, the Congress government in Telangana has jailed 2 women journalists for criticizing the chief minister. But the fact is, even today, the establishment is different from the government, and the establishment still sets the social agenda. So if you look at all these protests, you'll see the same suspects everywhere. A few award-winning authors, a few activist lawyers, some retired judges, some retired bureaucrats, and some general busybodies who protest at the slightest transgression in any state ruled by the current ruling dispensation, but look the other way when the same transgressions take place in Congress ruled states. I can give you at least a dozen examples of journalists being persecuted, activists being harassed in Congress ruled states, but they'll appear as shorts in newspapers, if at all. Whereas any such transgression in a BJP ruled state immediately becomes a big headline because
Yes.
there are people around who are ready to amplify those and make it sound as if India's become a very intolerant society.
Right, exactly. When the fact of the matter is that the legacy of the Congress is actually been steeped in curbing free speech and intolerance. So it was wonderful to talk to you, Arnab ji. And again, I can not recommend this book enough. The Wasted Decades, as I was saying in the beginning, this is, we all had a feeling, people who'd seen this era, and especially if you look at the economic number, like how did India get so far behind the Asian tigers? How did India get so far behind China in recent years? And when there was so much legacy of Indian wealth creation and Indian economic leadership, as well as Indian intellectual leadership in the past in history, and we came to a state where we became a laggard in almost all of these fields. And the answer to how that happened and why that happened is in this book, The Wasted Decades. Please, everybody, go and get a copy of it. It is hard to put down. It's chock full of facts and quotes and a narrative that can really take you to the heart of the problems. So thank you so much, Arnabji, and
Thank you.
look forward to getting more people engaging with this topic and having this book be widely read. Namaste.
Thank you. Thank you, Sankrantji. Namaste.